Hi, I'm Katie Young, a postdoctoral fellow at the Bill Lane Center for the American West at Stanford, and I'm delighted to moderate this panel. I've actually been thinking about attachment to the West and what it means, particularly as I prepare to leave it myself for the first time ever and start a job on the East Coast this fall. It's hard to put into words the attachment that we feel to places, and yet this attachment, this sense of place, is often, for many of us, at the very core of who we are. Wallace Stegner, one of our quintessential Western writers, wrote an essay called The Sense of Place that I think aptly situates this panel. Stegner begins the essay by quoting poet and writer Wendell Berry, who said, "If you don't know where you are, you don't know who you are." Stegner says that Berry, quote, is not talking about the kind of location that can be determined by looking at a map or a street sign. He is talking about the kind of knowing that involves the senses, the memory, the history of a family or tribe. He is talking about the knowledge of place that comes from working it in all weathers, making a living from it, suffering from its catastrophes, loving its mornings or evenings or hot noons. He is talking about the knowing that poets specialize in. We put this panel into the conference thanks to feedback from last year's conference. There was the idea of sense of place and people's emotional attachment to the land came up in panel after panel, and in the survey that we gave people after last year's conference, it was actually kind of the number one thing that came up that people wanted to have a panel about. As academics, and I think even as nonfiction writers of all types, we sometimes struggle to measure or capture or quantify, to study precisely that which we already somehow know or feel. The poet's knowledge of place that Stegner talks about, that connection to the land, is hard to put in academic parlance sometimes because it's knowledge that comes from your heart as much as your brain. I'm excited to have such an exciting and an eclectic group to talk about how sense of place is expressed and defined in the West. Professor John Lauk teaches history and political science at the University of South Dakota and has written extensively on politics and agriculture in the American West and Midwest. Professor Jen Brown is a Western and environmental historian at Texas A&M in Corpus Christi and the author of a recent book called Trout Culture, which is about fly fishing, and she's going to talk to us about that. It's also for sale outside. She'll sign it for you. I witnessed this. Dan Reineman is a postdoctoral fellow at the Lane Center for the American West at Stanford, and when he's not surfing in the Pacific Ocean, or as it turns out, on a river in Missoula — did you know you could surf on a river? I learned that yesterday. When he's not surfing, he studies coastal management and coastal resources. And finally, Elizabeth Zatch is a staff writer at the Rural Community Assistance Corporation in Sacramento and has also written for the New York Times and the Washington Post. So please join me in welcoming these four panelists.
Thank you, Katie. I really appreciate that, and I'm really glad you put this panel together on place because it speaks to the core reasons we're at a conference such as this. And I'm very glad you started off with Wallace Stegner. There's no other person, I think, who captures this so well. I assign my students that brilliant, short, smart essay by Stegner about figuring out your sense of place and how important it is to get your bearings in the world. And I think it's also great to have a discussion like this in a place like Montana because Montanans, well, I already had a sense of this already when I came in here, but after spending a few days here, there is definitely a strong sense of place among Montanans and in Montana, and I think it rivals Texans and New Yorkers in terms of their pride of place. I had to come in a little bit early due to airline complications, and so I had the opportunity on St. Patrick's Day to drive over to Butte, Montana, to spend the day, St. Patrick's Day, which I've heard about for years, why this is the place you want to be when it's St. Patrick's Day, and it was true. And I made the parade and had a few pints downtown at the M&M Lounge. And this is, if you want to get a sense of people who have a strong grounding in place go to Butte on St. Patrick's Day. And just a little shout out for my friend Dave Emmons, who taught in the history department here at the University of Montana for many, many years. He published a book called The Butte Irish, which if you're from Montana, you should definitely read. It's fantastic. And then he followed that up about a decade later with a book called The Irish in the West. And there's a very good description in there of these Irishmen who became part of this huge Irish diaspora spread all over the world, but most prominently in the United States. And you could think about that process as a process of place making. These Irish ended up in places like Butte, they ended up in places like Boston, and they ended up in places like Chicago. And like good Irishmen, they generally took them over and started running them and took over the politics at least. So, and if you want to get a good sense for the importance of place and how this can play a role in culture, there's probably no better place to begin than Ireland and Irish history. I was reading over in the hotel this morning, they gave us complimentary copies of the Wall Street Journal, and there was an article in there by Enya, and she was talking about her childhood in Ireland, on the west coast of Ireland. And in terms of the strength of Irish culture, Irish dancing and language and literature, I mean, the west coast of Ireland is the heartland. And that was the part of Ireland least destroyed by the English, I guess you could say. So this sense of place is very, very important. And Montana is a great place to explore it. I hit several used bookstores when I was here in Montana in both Butte and in Missoula. And you may be familiar with this old book about Montana called A History of Montana, High, Wide, and Handsome. The High, Wide, and Handsome State. I mean, the whole title of the book conveys the importance of place. And then there's another classic book about Montana, The Last Best Place. And I was reading last night, you may remember in the 70s when we were doing the bicentennial celebrations of the country, which was about the time there were all these efforts to reform constitutions. You were talking about this, there was a constitutional convention or a new constitution in Montana, but lots of places went through this kind of heavy editing or reform of their constitutions. But Norton put out this great series on all the different states, and Clark Spence, the Westerner, did the book on Montana. And but if you want to get a sense of place for lots of other states, look at that series. But I was just reading the book on Montana last night, and the chapter that really speaks to what we're talking about here today, one of the chapters is entitled Montana, the Most Western Part of the West. And so, again, an assertion of the importance of Montana's identity and sense of place. Well, the idea of place is it's an important and contested idea or concept, and it plays varying roles in people's lives. In Montana, I think it's very strong. In other places and among other peoples, it exerts less energy or force. I mean, there is a kind of existential outsideness or alienation or disconnectedness that some people suffer from. And, there are displaced migrants, people who have no home. I was listening to Public Radio International yesterday, and they were interviewing these poor Syrians who were displaced into refugee camps in Lebanon, and it was very sad to hear them talk about the fact that they have no more roots. They have no more home. Their neighborhood back in Damascus has been razed by the Syrian Air Force. And this idea of homesickness, or the absence of a home, or not being able to connect with your home, it was for a long time considered a psychological malady or a mental illness. And this is how it was diagnosed as late as the 19th century. It was connected to the idea of nostalgia, or the missing of home. A nostalgia was considered a mental condition. And they used to discharge soldiers from the armies during the Civil War for having acute cases of nostalgia. So there is a consequence to not having a home and not being placed. And that's why I think we're very lucky here in the rural West, where the condition, for the most part, is a sense of placedness, a sense of roots. And Montana is a great example of that. But there are challenges to this, and this is what I talk about in the book that Jeff and I were promoting this morning. There's an essay in there about place in the American West that I did, and I talk about some of the challenges to place. Place, many intellectuals think, and there's certainly a lot of reason for this, is eroding in for many of us. We are awash every day in the internet and in mass media and mass culture, and our local organs of local culture are diminishing. There used to be, most places had a very strong local newspaper that covered local events and promoted local affairs and civic affairs very well. But, you know, you certainly don't need me to tell you what's happened to local reporting and local newspapers. And with that comes a diminishment of a sense of place. And so intellectuals who have been promoters of regionalism and regional thinking and place-based thinking have always had fears about this generic homogenization that may undermine our sense of place. Lastly, I'll just make the point that people who are placed in Montana or in Texas or in South Dakota or wherever, they often will bristle at efforts to change the place that they're living in. And they want to maintain some local control over the place that they love so much. And I think that's reflected in the polling data that we just saw. You know, people want to maintain some degree of local autonomy, and this is what the example of the Montana Constitution demonstrates too. And this is why in this poll, 60% of people want the state of Montana to have control over these lands and not leave it to the federal government, who is a distant landlord who has different incentives for how they run the land. And so this idea of place, the concept of place, and the role of place and culture bleeds over into our politics and creates these sort of frictions. And then another chapter in the book talks about what happens when a state like Montana feels invaded by outsiders. Californians, for example, they always take the brunt of it. Sorry about that. That's why you see the bumper sticker, "Don't Californicate Montana," "Don't Californicate Idaho," etc. There is this friction about who's going to be in control of a local place. Well, I see I'm getting the hook here, but I'll just say that we're very lucky in the rural West to have this commitment to our homes and our roots and our places, because this kind of commitment makes us care about a place more. It makes us participate in civic affairs more, because when we love a place, we care how it's governed and how it's managed and what its future is. When you're displaced and you don't have a connection to your home or state or city or whatever, you care less about those things, and we all suffer the consequences. So if you want to know more about this idea of place in the rural West, I commend our recent book to you. There's a lot of different examples of how it works itself out in the West. Thank you very much.
Okay, good morning. Can you all hear me okay in the back? All right, well, thank you all for coming. First of all, I'd like to thank the Bill Lane Center, the Eccles family, the University of Montana for organizing and hosting the conference. I'm excited to be back here in Western Montana. It's where I grew up. Actually, Montana in general is where I grew up, and I'm glad to kind of share my research with you all today. Today, I plan to reflect on the history of place, trout, and fly fishing in the Rockies. Just as a show of hands, how many of you fly fish? Okay, rough crowd. A lot of hands up here. Since historians love anniversaries, I'll start with the 40th anniversary of a charming little book published in the spring of 1976 by the University of Chicago Press. Some of you may have heard of it. River Runs Through It. Norman Maclean was an author and a retired English professor, and he wrote a deeply personal narrative about fly fishing and family in Montana. Reckoning with loss, Maclean's lyrical voice told a touching, personal, and often hilarious story that quickly became a classic, and it remains poignant today 4 decades later. The anniversary of a river's publication invites historical reflection. Both before and after Maclean's seminal work, trout fishing helped define a sense of place in the Rocky Mountain West. In the book, Maclean shared stories of fly fishing for gigantic, non-native rainbow trout and brown trout. Much of the meaning might have been lost on readers had Maclean's quarry not been widespread species not only in Montana, but around the world. Excuse me. The presence of trout around the world ensured that readers recognized both Maclean's prey and his authority. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, with the exception of Antarctica, rainbow trout, brown trout, and brook trout were introduced and subsequently naturalized on every continent around the world for sport fishing purposes. Fly fishing has a much longer history. Angling, meaning fishing with a hook and a line, has existed for thousands of years, with evidence dating back to 42,000 years before present, during the Paleolithic era. Humans angled long before they invented agriculture, used the wheel, or wrote their stories. And as a form of angling, fly fishing has a definitive written record dating back to 200 AD, when the Roman Claudius Aelianus first described Macedonian fly fishing. Dating back millennia, fly fishing has diverse origins in Europe, Japan, and elsewhere. So if trout live almost everywhere and fly fishing has an expansive history, why do they seem so Western? And this question is rooted in the construction of place, highlighting an important theme of both my book and this conference, that place matters. From the mid-19th century to the present, Westerners physically and ideologically refashioned the region. Over time, many trout species became naturalized in cold water lakes and streams, and Westerners gave new meaning to these trout by forming a distinctively Western and regional fly fishing culture, as well as by marketing and selling the Western trout fishing experience. The rise of Western fly fishing traditions came out of the popularity of fishing and its increasing importance for the Western economy. During the first few decades of the 19th or 20th century, I should say, growing numbers of tackle shops, fly shops, fishing outfitters, fly tyers, they developed distinctive regional fly patterns and fishing traditions. Made famous in the final sections of A River Runs Through It, Missoula fly tyer Norman Means pattern called the Bunyan bug, for instance, represented a popular Western dry fly. Another Missoulian, former wig maker Franz B. Pott, patented his popular mite series of flies, hiring young college women from the University of Montana to help with the craft. As the fly fishing industry grew, so too did its boosterism and economy. And advertisements. And advertisements, they sold the conveniences of newly built roads and highways, drawing a fine line between modern conveniences and kind of a rugged, pristine Western experience waiting to be had. One 1940 brochure proclaimed that Montana has 32,000 miles of trout streams, 4,600 miles of improved highways. This marketing and economic growth, along with the cultural power of trout fishing that was so present in The River Runs Through It, translated into tangible benefits for conservation. Holding political sway in the post-World War II era, anglers and their allies in state fishing game departments brought water pollution and habitat protection to the forefront of Western environmental issues. In the Missoula area, the Western Montana Fish and Game Department boasted almost 3,000 members by the 1950s, a time when the population of entire Missoula County was about 40,000. The association worked against water pollution and fish kills along the Clark Fork River, as well as volunteered for other conservation work. Likewise, anglers elsewhere in the West worked with the same grassroots fervor, playing a key role in fish protection during the post-war era. This sentiment only grew in the years following, illustrating one of the most significant aspects of a sense of place, a sense of belonging and community, one that has been guided by a connection to the natural world. In the last 40 years, Norman Maclean's Montana has become both a historical reality and a powerful mythology that has had real advantages for conservation. Recently, writer Rick Bass attributed the success of Montana's 1998 voter initiative that banned cyanide heap leach gold mining to A River Runs Through It. And he said, we never would have won if it hadn't been for Norman Maclean's novel or Robert Redford's movie. So when Maclean ended A River with the hope that a fish will rise, he taught readers that trout waters created hope anew. In a similar fashion, I'd like to conclude today with the optimism that the history of fly fishing and trout in the West has created a powerful sense of place that will be continued to be evoked for a variety of Western environmental issues. Thank you.
Thank you for having us. This is lovely so far. So Bruce Babbitt was the former U.S. Secretary of the Interior, and he once described the economy of the West as undergoing a transition from extraction to attraction. And I just kind of would like you to, as I talk, hold that notion in your minds, that shift from extraction to attraction. As I think this is a really interesting and important context, not only for what we're talking about today, but also sort of for broader issues in terms of a Western sense of place. I'm an environmental social scientist at the Bill Lane Center, and as such, I thought it would be good as a person on this panel to talk a little bit about place and in terms of how place scholars study and understand place, and by that I mean place with a capital P. So I'll share a little bit about place scholarship, and the history of place scholarship, and then I'll talk a little bit about the geographic setting in the west of the West where I work, and I'll tell you about a small study we did in California. And then I'll try to bring it all back together, and we'll bring it home on this panel. When we talk about place and sense of place, what do we really mean by this? And it turns out that there is indeed a whole body of theory that centers on this concept of place. And this was first developed by human geographers in the 1970s, and it's since been explored in many academic disciplines, from anthropology to psychology, forestry, architecture, urban planning. And the central idea is that there's a difference between abstract space and meaningful place in terms of how we as humans move through and relate and use the world around us. It's the difference between those places that we just pass through arbitrarily and those that we inhabit and make meaning in. The places where personal and social processes occur, where growth and identity develop. So probably the canonical example of place is home. So home is not just where we sleep at night. Home is where we partake in the rituals of daily life. It's where we nurture partnerships, raise children. And so home is very, very important for us. But these same kind of relationships, as we've been discussing, also develop between people and their families, their neighborhoods, their communities, indeed their regions, and even their countries. So we can make the same comparisons in outdoor and recreational contexts, and these are increasingly a focus of study among place scholars. And work in this field has found that people do indeed develop these very strong place attachments to recreational places. So this is the stream you fly fish on, the trail you take your kids to every year. And so it seems like this wonky academic thing sort of define this place attachment and measure it. But from the perspective of resource management, it turns out this is very, very important because of this relationship between our love, our attachment to place, and our actions toward them. And so place attachment has been found to predict people's pro-environmental, place protective behaviors. It can motivate their participation in planning processes. And it can help determine the efficacy of natural resource policy. So in other words, people's sense of place really and truly can inform how we can and should manage natural resources. So as the West continues this transition from extraction to attraction, I think this is going to be increasingly important. So people change, communities change, climate's changing, places change, and places are going to continue to change. So we need to understand how people's sense of place fits into these processes of change and how we're going to manage them. So we can zoom in on what we might think of as, what I like to think of as the western border of the West. It's unclear whether California belongs in the West, but that's where I'm from, so I'll just bear with me. I think this is a region that really exemplifies this shift from extraction to attraction. So California was sequentially renowned for gold and forestry and fisheries, but now it is famous for, among other things, its beaches and its coastline, which drive tremendous visitation and tourism and are economically very important in the state of California. And as a result of some of that attractive force of those resources, there are nearly 40 million Californians, with the vast majority of them living along the Pacific coast. But despite all of that population, much of the California coast remains very rural with few people and very little development. A lot of rangeland and, a lot of rangeland and intact coastlines. And those of you who are familiar with the California coast might expect that this is true, obviously, in the remote northern coast and central coast, but it is also true in the southern coast and in the highly populous urban Southern California. And so I'm particularly interested in this large empty region that bounds the western boundary of the coast, which of course is the Pacific Ocean. And I am indeed interested in the group of people that you are most likely to find immersed in that body of water. And these, of course, are surfers. Surfing is a major part of the attraction of the California coast. And so what we wanted to understand is whether or not surfing and these coastal places factor into the sense of place of the California coast. And more specifically, we wanted to know whether the waves themselves, these specific locations along the coast, these recreational amenities where surfers surf, we wanted to know if they are merely these abstract recreational spaces, or are they in themselves kind of more important capital P places. And we wanted to find what, if anything, they mean. What is their value to California's roughly 1 million surfers? So we know that surfing is an important part of the identity of many coastal communities. Huntington Beach, for example, proclaims itself Surf City, USA. And I love this story. They actually have the exclusive right to that title only after a protracted legal battle with the city of Santa Cruz. And it has worked. So this is a typical day of surfing in Huntington Beach. But we also know that many surfers go to great lengths to get away from that kind of crowd and to explore the quieter parts of the coast. And so we really wanted to investigate the kind of relationships that surfers along this really diverse coastline have with this place. So my co-author, Nicole Arden, and I surveyed roughly 1,000 California surfers. They were quite eager and completed the survey with astonishing proportion. And so we used some standardized approaches to collect both quantitative and qualitative data to measure people's place attachment to the coast. And what we found is that for a great many surfers, surf spots are indeed very important capital P places for them. These are places that are part of their families, part of their identity, part of their heritage and their traditions. These are places where social processes, growth, friendship actually happen. And we found significantly that surfers actually think of their surf spots in some cases as a home or a home away from home. And we found that disruptions, we found that the place attachment was highest in the most rural parts of the coast. So that's, those places do exist in California. And we found that disruptions to place attachments are really significant and problematic to the people who are expressing them, something that John mentioned already. So it is because of these attachments that people are motivated to protect their places in the face of disruption, in the face of change. And this is just a crowd showing up to protest at a public meeting over a proposed highway expansion. You can see the I-5 up in the upper right-hand corner. The highway expansion would have done damage to this public park and beach and estuary. And this is the largest crowd to ever attend a coastal planning meeting in the state's history. So hopefully I've given you a little bit of insight into what place attachment is and why it's significant. But how do surfers' attachments to coastal places inform our conversation today? And I think, again, it has to do with this shift from extraction to attraction in the West. So industries that once benefited from Western places by deliberately altering them are now, different industries are arising that are benefiting by trying to keep these places the same. And coasts, like much of the American West, are regions that are not staying the same. They're undergoing significant change, whether as a result of environmental change or demographic change. And so these are regions where it's continue to be important to understand people's sense of place, their attachment to these areas, so that we can manage them more effectively. And that's all I've got. Thank you very much.
Good morning. I'm Elizabeth Zatch, and by way of introduction, I was selected as a media fellow last year at the Bill Lane Center for the American West, and I wanted to thank Jeff McGee for selecting me to pursue this project that kind of took over my life last year and continues to hold much interest for me, although technically the fellowship is over with. I am also the full-time staff writer at the Rural Community Assistance Corporation, a nonprofit based in West Sacramento, but we are focused on rural poverty throughout the American West. So I essentially cover the 13 states, including Alaska and Hawaii. They have me going out covering just about everything related to rural poverty, whether that be affordable housing, economic development, tribal lands issues, and so forth. RCAC was established about 40 years ago and kind of grew out of the farm worker housing movement in California Central Valley. In fact, I'm working with some people who knew Cesar Chavez, and as the years went on, they expanded their reach and not just dealing with affordable housing, but also got into the lending business, started focusing on environmental issues, particularly water and water infrastructure, Native Americans, and community and economic development. I got the job there in 2014. I was actually living in Berlin, Germany for the previous 15 years. I'm a native Californian. I decided to move back to the state because my father had passed away and my mother was alone. Got the job as the staff writer and suddenly was forced to come up to speed very quickly about rural issues in the American West. I got in touch with other writers that were covering the American West, and through them found out about the Bill Lane Center. And was curious about the center more as a resource, but at the same time found out about the fellowship program. And spent one afternoon, like I said, trying to come up to speed with Rural West issues, reading several reports from the USDA about the Farm Bill that was passed in 2014. And as I was doing that, I came across a couple of sentences in that report that had to do with women working on farms and ranches in the nation, and that their numbers had increased significantly. The report looked at the last 30 years and had found that the women that were working on farms and ranches in the nation had tripled. There were just two sentences referring to that, pretty matter of fact, but I was rather curious, and I started to think and wonder, who are these women? Managed to get a hold of the lead author of the report. He's an economist at the Economic Research Service in Washington, D.C. Tracked him down, called him up, introduced myself, and asked him what I thought was a pretty simple question: who are these women? And he responded, I have no idea. Later on, as I would end up meeting a lot of these women and I would tell them the story, they would sort of roll their eyes and say, oh, typical man. But this was kind of the impetus, wanting to find out more about these women. And so I put together an application to the Bill Lane Center, wanting to research this, essentially. I had the numbers, which I'll get to in a moment, but I was more interested in the narrative, who these women are, their motivation, their backgrounds, their circumstances. And in fact, the researcher that I was talking to, James Williamson, at the end of that conversation, he told me, if you could go out and find out who these women are, it would really contribute a lot to this area of research. Found out at the end of 2014 that I had been named a fellow, and was very happy about that. Like I said, had the numbers, and the only thing left to do after that, which I'll get to in a moment, was to hit the road. But before that, just to show you what I was looking at, you'll see here the steady increase of U.S. farms and ranches by gender of the principal operator from 1978 to 2007. The numbers, like I said, were very intriguing to me. When I was on the phone with the economist, he explained to me also that women tended to own the land that they're farming and ranching. And I'll get to a little bit of that later. As I started the research, and the way I started it was I had heard about an online sort of chat group for farming and ranching, actually just in California. I became a member and just started tracking the conversations that were happening. People that were posting questions about everything from soil to farm equipment to whatever. The learning curve, as I mentioned, was pretty steep. I'm a city girl, so I was having to get up to speed very quickly on various terms and so forth. Every time I saw a woman or a woman's name, a woman posting anything, then I would contact her privately off of the site, tell her who I was and what I was doing, and asked her if she would meet with me or talk with me. And uniformly, they were all pretty interested and enthusiastic. And of course, these women knew other women who knew other women who knew other women, and it just sort of grew that way. I was finding out, as an aside, as I was starting to do the research more, that 222,000 women are principal farm operators, or the person most responsible for making day-to-day decisions about the farm. 1.5 million women are spouses of principal operators. 1/3 of these are secondary operators who participate in decision-making. Nearly 1 million identify themselves as non-operator spouses, but 46% say they provide farm labor, collectively contributing 371 million hours on farms and ranches. Some more characteristics: women farmers and ranchers tend to be younger than their male counterparts, and the number of men farming and ranching is decreasing. More women are entering than are exiting. Women farm operators are more highly educated than their male counterparts. Women operators often rely on off-farm work and income. And women are farming despite negative returns. And this was something that, as I started to get out and to meet these women, that impressed me greatly. When you think about how difficult it is to farm and ranch these days, these women kind of became heroines to me. So like I said, the only thing left to do was to actually hit the road. And through the fellowship funding, that's what I did. I spent cumulatively about 2 months traveling the American West. And like I said, had contacts, women who knew women who knew women, and it kind of became this chain reaction. I visited just about every state in the American West, not Alaska and Hawaii. Pig farms, sheep farms, or cattle ranches, just about every kind of delicacy under the sun that could be farmed. Big farms, small farms, CSAs, went to farmers markets, went to Grange meetings, went also to a lot of Cattle Women's Association meetings, very raucous. A couple times I would walk into the room and there would be 200-300 women there, and I knew I'd hit the mother lode. Notice also it was a very graying population, particularly among the ranchers. So I'll just leave you with some highlights and snapshots of the research I did. One of the most memorable experiences was visiting the Abbey of St. Walburga in Virginia Dale, Colorado, on the Wyoming border. It's a Benedictine abbey, 25 nuns, and very much a working ranch. The nuns get up at 4 in the morning. I know this because I spent nearly a week there shadowing them. They go to Mass, they sing, then they breakfast in silence, and then off come the habits, and they're dressed it's a very traditional, Benedictine abbey. And then they put on their working clothes, and they get out to the ranch, and they have pigs, and they also make honeys, and they sell their products as well online and also in a small shop on the abbey. Part of the fellowship required that I not only just go out and have fun and see the American West, but also that I produce some sort of journalistic work. The visit to the Abbey caught the attention of High Country News, and a story on the Abbey appeared in High Country News in October of last year. One of the women that I visited was Laura Jean Schneider, who also happens to be a columnist at High Country News. She and her husband are ranching on the Mescalero Apache Indian Reservation in New Mexico, very isolated. Went out to see her in September of last year. She talked to me quite a bit about the isolation. There are about 27 miles of rough road from really the nearest form of any civilization, that would be Ruidoso, New Mexico. She kind of became pivotal in my research, pointing me in a lot of very good directions for meeting more women who were out there farming and ranching. I learned also toward the end of the year that the Washington Post had also learned a little bit about my project and were interested in publishing my research. And they ran the story on the front page in January. Unfortunately, it coincided with this major snowstorm, and they ended up trimming quite a bit of the narrative. But still, I was very pleased that there was attention given to the stories. Just a few more images of some of the women that I was meeting. Donna Schroeder, who ranches in Shonkin, Montana, kind of near Great Falls. 77 years old and one of the very few handful of women who's been inducted into the National Cowboy Hall of Fame. I kind of characterized her as truly being born to the land. She'll probably end up dying on her horse. absolutely loves what she does and has a number of younger ranchers in the area who help her with the physical aspect of it. But she will run anywhere up to like 200,000 head of cattle. Bernie Barlow, who ranched together with her husband in Gillette, Wyoming, only ended up selling the ranch last year. Her husband died about 10 years ago. She's a native Cambodian. Her husband had met her when he was doing some volunteer work in Cambodia in a program that predates the Peace Corps. They married. They ended up going back to his family's ranch near Gillette, Wyoming. And she, together with her husband, ranched there for about 30 years until he died. And it was very much a partnership, and kind of unusual considering the time and the place that they were working together. Loves what she was doing, but the ranch just became too much for her, and she ended up selling it, like I said, last year. Brenda Kirsch, Frechtig, I also profiled her in my story for the Washington Post. Her father appointed her to essentially run the farm. He wanted to retire. The parents are still alive and around. But she took over last year, 200,000 acres. And she's managing or overseeing about 15 people working on the farm. Has a business degree, which increasingly is becoming very important for doing this kind of work. Told me about how both times when she was pregnant, she was out there managing and working herself. Megan Brown in Oroville, California, raises heritage red wattle pigs and has kind of made a name for herself, sells her product to restaurants throughout California, and is also a fixture at agricultural conferences. The best adjective I can use to describe her is swashbuckling. She just about killed me on her ATV, on her Polaris ATV when I went to go visit her, but very enthusiastic about more women entering the field, so to speak. So I'll just conclude here in letting you know that the title of my talk was pretty much stolen. The title, I took it from the title of a book about women who were homesteading the West. When I was staying at the Abbey of St. Walburga, which is also offers guest retreats, I met some retreatants there, and one of them, by pure coincidence, was a woman who had written this book. Her name is Marcia Meredith Hensley, and when we found out what each other was doing, she gave me a copy of her book, which was very inspirational for the rest of my research that I did with the fellowship. And just in conclusion, a Western sense of place and definitions, relationships, and expressions. As I mentioned, having lived in Germany for the last, 15 years, up until 2 years ago, this fellowship really gave me the opportunity and the great luxury to explore this sense of place, being rootless myself in a sense, and coming to terms with being back here in the American West. Thank you.
So thanks to the four of you for these really terrific and engaging presentations. I have a few questions. I'll start with one maybe, and then we'll open it up, and maybe I'll ask the others if there's time. But I guess for Dan, I was really struck by your finding that surfers are more subjectively attached to rural locations than less rural ones. I wondered, what is it about rurality, you think, that causes this connection to the land to develop, and how this might be different from people's connection to cities? And I don't know, maybe the rest of you want to weigh in on that as well.
Are we live? I would say a couple things. First, the places where I suspect the people who are describing those stronger attachments tend by subjective standard to be more naturally beautiful than the more populous parts of the coast. So I think that the physical aspects of the place are one really important component. But also you find much more close-knit communities of surfers in the water in those places, and so that sort of speaks to the social aspect of a place. So that the physical environment structures social interactions, and those social interactions are really important for bonding people, not just together, but to the place itself.
Do any of you want to weigh in on it, Jen or John or Elizabeth?
Yeah, I would just like to kind of add that a lot of the best trout fishing is outside of cities, and that has to do with some material realities of industries within the cities, wastewater, pollution. There are very few cities, Calgary, Alberta is one offhand, where fishing's really good in town, but to find the big fish, often you have to go elsewhere.
Okay, well, let's open it up to questions.
Hi, Jamie Allison, Christopher Newport University. So this follows up on that. My question was going to be, is there something about ruralness that intensifies the sense of place, which I kind of hear in the echoes of all these talks. And being a non-Westerner, an Easterner, a Southerner, I'd push back a little bit up to that. So I don't know if it's a question or argument. Is it not ruralness, or is it just transience, which of course is connected to ruralness, but not always? Like I got my PhD in Charlottesville, Virginia, literally in the shadow of Monticello and Thomas Jefferson, and you can't walk down the sidewalk without knocking over a Civil War a reenactor or some plaque of some sort. So is it ruralness, or is it something else that is a characteristic of ruralness that intensifies a sense of place?
I mean, the question that follows from that, that's implicit in that, is the definition of ruralness, which, as we heard either this morning or yesterday, is variously defined in many different ways by different people. And so, how's that for a non-answer? As a question to you.
I think there is a connection between the intensity of place or feelings of place and ruralness. Now, you can identify connections on other levels, but ruralness connotes a familiarity, a closeness to the land. It's often tied to agriculture. It's often tied to ranching, natural resource industries, and ownership too. If, who has a stronger sense of place than a Montanan whose ranch has been in the family for 100 years? That's probably the highest degree of intensity of place that you can have. A higher degree of intensity that you would probably have if you had moved from, say, California to Montana, where you can develop a sense of place, you can learn about a place, you can come into a place and learn its history and its rhythms, but it's probably not going to be as intense, or at least the same, as someone who is naturally rooted there.
I think that's an interesting question. I'd like to say that how we define the sense of place is often connections to nature. And for modern Americans, their view of nature is nature out there, right, outside of cities, away from people. And so I think that ruralness definitely plays a role in connections to the natural world, which define a sense of place.
Hi, Mark Trahant, UND. 200 miles over the mountain is Riggins, Idaho. And when folks who do combat fishing don't get the same press that fly fishing does, but if you look at Riggins, Idaho during salmon season, it's a cross-section of the population with people who are more likely to buy their supplies at Walmart than at a fishing store. What's that story, and what does it say about the region?
Well, I think there's definitely a divide in how and where people are fishing. Certainly kind of fly fishing for a long time was both an activity that was reached broad classes of people, but it's also known in the West as a kind of an elite tourist activity. But if you look at people, say, walleye fishing in large lakes in the region, that sort of thing, the tackle is different, the reasons are different, but often the kind of requirements of a boat and other sorts of gear needed, there's a mix, so I don't have an easy answer of there's a clear class divide or not.
My name's Zach Brown, and I work for a nonprofit here in Montana called One Montana. And our mission is to bridge the rural-urban divide. And to a question that was just asked, I thought I'd comically add that the way we define urban for our purposes at One Montana is population centers of more than 9,000. So for whatever that's worth, it works for us. My question for, I also serve in the Montana legislature, and my question's for Dr. Lauk. I noticed you did a lot of research and wrote books about the effect of place on, I imagine place was inherent in your analysis of political races and politics in general. But I also wanted to quickly push back and say that Montana's sense of place is better than Texas.
I agree.
There are too many Texans in Texas, but that's another time. The question is, I guess, when in your work, have you really noticed a trend in terms of the sense of place or state exceptionalism and the effect that that has on the political discourse and the political happenings in a state? And is that regional? Are there particular trends in the West that make the West stand out from other parts of the country?
Well, this issue of place is extremely important in politics. There's no question about it. In this chapter I did for this book, one of the examples I give, because it was going on at the time I wrote the chapter, was this Senate race in Montana 4 years ago, I guess it was, where the candidates were basically trying to out-Montana each other. One was saying, well, I'm a farmer, I'm a true farmer. And then the comeback to that was, well, you're an organic farmer, so that's kind of weird. And so that was used to diminish his status. And then the other guy was playing up his role as a rancher, and that's more true Montanan. And there is this very old divide between ranchers or stockmen and dirt farmers, which still runs deep. I'm sure it still has some degree of traction here in Montana. So this is very much an issue. So I've been in Montana a few days, and I've been talking to people, well, what's going on in Montana? What's the political situation? And people often bring up the governor's race. Well, there's going to be a governor's race this year. It's going to be really interesting. We have a pretty popular governor, but we have a major challenger to him who has a lot of money, but he's from New Jersey. That's the comment I heard from everyone. So this is going to hurt this candidate. Whoever he is, I don't remember the name, but so yeah, this issue of place is a very big deal in politics. Now, what I was going to comment on to answer your question is that, and this relates to the law professor who was talking about the Constitution this morning. I was thinking about this when he was talking, that the diminishment of localism and regionalism and state-based politics hurts the political process, because I think, as a lot of political scientists have commented, our politics is becoming increasingly nationalized. And there's more and more national forces interfering, basically, in state politics. So they take sides, they make things more partisan, and people vote more on a national basis than they used to. But in a place like Montana, which is very small, and basically everyone in politics knows everyone else, you have a very high degree of likelihood that, a couple of prominent leaders can go in the back room, and the smoke-filled room proverbially, and where they make the sausage in the legislative process, and get a deal done. But when there's more interfering from the outside, where people paint things in stark contrast, red versus blue or whatever, that becomes more difficult. But when there's an older form of politics, which is more local, more intimate, more based on people knowing each other, and if you know somebody, if you go to the Rotary Club with them or the same church with them, you're less likely to attack them with TV ads. It just makes politics a little more simple. But unfortunately, that's not the direction of politics right now.
So I actually want to jump in with a follow-up question, and I'm hoping other panelists will weigh in. The rural sense of place often seems coupled with this independence that may frustrate or work against possibilities for collective action, and in turn means that people very attached to certain places are often unable to secure the resources that would allow them to thrive in those places. And I wonder, is there a way to use or tap into attachment to place to facilitate better access to things like medical care or legal services?
So a couple of weeks ago, I attended a women ranchers conference at the Piscenes Ranch, which is not far from Stanford. There were 20 mostly young women there who were talking about these issues, healthcare, very important to them, especially being in these isolated areas and doing somewhat dangerous work. And they were talking about different models, for how this could come off the ground, but no answers yet.
Can I ask a question? It's Pat Shea again from the University of Utah. There's an increasing migration from rural areas into urban areas, and a recent study showed that children under the age of 15 spend almost 8 hours a day in front of a screen. And I'd be interested, particularly your view, Catherine, given your time in Germany, as to whether the virtual reality that these kids are being inundated with relates to an actual physical place, and is there a harmony or a discord there?
It's kind of hard for me to answer that because I was living in Berlin and I'm not sure how to answer that, but I will say that I came back to the States in 2014, and certainly the screen time that I see among young people here is far greater than what I did observe in Germany.
And this has a strongly negative effect on senses of place, I think, because you can sit and scroll down Twitter in the suburbs of LA just as well as you can in rural Montana. So no offense to Jeff if he's still here, but the fact that some of these places in the rural West who aren't getting broadband and internet access, that's okay. In a way, it sort of fosters place.
Well, take electricity away and they won't look at their machines.
No, but the flip side of that is there is a degree of community and place that can be fostered with the internet too. I mean, I know the state of South Dakota, oddly enough, has the highest percentage per capita usage of Facebook in the country. And most of the people on Facebook are following other people in their little towns, and they share information, and they say, oh, this is where the fire was at this farm or whatever. And this, in a way, sort of makes up for the collapse of the old-time newspapers where we used to get our news.
Yeah, I would just add one more thing in answering or in reference to your question. I've undertaken another study through my work on rural health care, and we'll be looking at that this year and producing several stories related to that. This is based on the fact that there's been a rash of rural hospital closures in the last 6 years, essentially one a month, nationwide. And in starting the research on this, of course, the question, I'm also looking at telemedicine and sort of the promising aspect of that, video conferencing, where rural patients can video conference with their doctors and with specialists. But the issue I keep coming back up against is the broadband. Will that be available to these rural patients, if that's the answer?
Hi, this is Dave Cameron again. I'd like to comment on how the word place is actually used in ranching communities in Montana. Almost exclusively, a place is a site of an abandoned homestead, and it's referred to by the person, the Heinz place, whatever, so on and so forth. Very seldom does it refer broadly to any area, but there's usually some remnant left of its having been occupied by humans. The neighboring ranches are all outfits, seldom places. And in some cases, the outfits are known mainly by the pickup that gets to the city. But it's a restricted use, that's all I'm saying.
And the most common way of phrasing this is probably the home place. Well, he's farming over at the home place today. And everyone knows what that is if you're in the local community, at least the people that have been there for a long time.
Thanks. Josh Reed, I teach American Indian history. So my question will, well, my approach is definitely shaping this question. Something that's is striking me from our discussion with this panel is what's missing, and that's kind of the indigenous sense of place. And so that leads me to kind of thinking about the polling numbers that were discussed a little earlier. Or if there's something, is there something about the rural Wests that you guys are describing or that you're tapping into that comes from this displacement of Native peoples? And kind of back to that polling data, which highlights that lack of support for tribal sovereignty. How much do you think this reflects a fear that sovereign tribal nations threaten the rural West's sense of place, ironically, kind of in the same way that there's this fear of outsiders, nefarious Californians, kind of coming into our places.
Well, I'll take a stab at that from perhaps a perspective you wouldn't expect. In Hawaii, which we could argue about whether it's in the West, it's certainly West. The indigenous Hawaiian community is not recognized by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and so there isn't a tribal lands issue. But anywhere in the state, not just in the water, locals are Hawaiians, and you could live there your entire life as a haole, a white person. You could be a third-generation white person, but you'll never be local in Hawaii. So that sort of the concept of who is of the place there ties deeply into the indigenous Hawaiian roots. So.
I think that's a great question. Couple things I wanted to address here. One is that the local natives also use the Missoula area for fishing. So there'd be seasonal migrations along the Clark Fork for bull trout, that sort of thing. So fishing both on and off the reservation, pretty common in there. A lot of the clashes between whites and natives, I don't think come until later, 1970s and 1980s. And one of the biggest cases, at least in Montana, was on the Crow Reservation along the Bighorn River, which became over time a very well-known kind of blue ribbon trout stream. But a series of court cases in the 70s and eventually reached the Supreme Court in 81, the Crows lost the right to the river, but it was only after an extensive kind of growth of a trout culture and economy in Montana. So I think that's an interesting question, but those time periods of dispossession and displacement come at surprising times, at least revolving around trout and fishing in the West.
I've got a comment and a question. First of all, I think since we have the powers that be and the Lane Center assembled here today, and I'm sure you're thinking down the road, one possible conference topic and later book might be an exploration of place in the rural West by way of the subregions of the rural West. So we could have someone explore, the trout streams of the rural West, someone explore the beach culture of the rural West, someone explore the native senses of place in the American West. And we could have Dave Lewis explore the canyon lands of Utah, and someone could write about the cattle ranchers of Montana, because these are all kind of distinct phases of Western place, but they have their own nuances. And then you could explore some of the frictions that exist between them. You know, there's definitely be a working class miner's sense of place among all the people who worked in Gillette, Wyoming, which would bump up against the sense of place by the Californians that move in there because they want to enjoy, you know, Jackson Hole or the amenities of Wyoming or whatever. That might be a good way to organize a conference and a good way to explore all these nooks and crannies in the West. Because as historians have talked about for a long time, there are many Wests, many sub-Wests, and that would be a fun way to outline place. The comment I had, or the question I had, and this is for the panelists here, and this was prompted by Dan's slides, and a comment that several of us made about if you have a sense of place, you care about how it's governed a lot more. And I think that fosters a kind of conservation ethic, a kind of Aldo Leopold approach to life. And I think if people are connected to a local place, they're going to be much more interested in conservation or whatever, and that would probably be reflected in your polling data. But a lot of times environmental groups, environmental activists or whatever, they talk about these issues on a global scale. And I thought about this when you had the map of the globe up, which is sort of amorphous and disconnected to people. And when you start talking about global warming and all of this, it has a somewhat alienating effect. But if you couch it in or frame it in terms of, hey, this is going to screw up this really great trout fishing that we've had for generations and we've enjoyed for generations, our family has, that has a much more stronger effect on people's attitudes. So I don't know, I just thought I'd get your reaction to that way of framing these issues and whether or not that's more effective.
I think it certainly is, and some other ongoing work that we're doing is sort of looking at what are the local implications of these global changes and giving people the opportunity to maybe they don't see what's happening, they don't see the implications of large-scale global change in their local place, because sometimes it's hard to perceive slow change taking place over a long time. But I would agree very strongly that if you can find ways to make those connections visible in some way, either visually or with facts and figures, that people are very responsive to that.
Hi, I'm Karen Adams from the University of Montana. I'm really struck by how this conversation is so much about the history of how we think about the place in history. There's some really exciting initiatives here at the university now that have to do with thinking about place, from a more scientific ecosystem sort of point of view. And the Montana Institute on Ecosystems is a collaboration between the University of Montana and Montana State that involves scientists collaborating to interact with communities to talk about the effects of natural processes on communities and the way that communities can collaborate to understand their similarities and so forth. So I would hope that we might think about, how place is changing given technology and climate and things like that, and how some of the things we know about how place has been constructed in the past might serve us in thinking about how we could reimagine the West, politically and socially in the future.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I'd just jump in. Two quick follow-ups. One, place really is a very multi-dimensional concept. There's the natural physical place, there's the biological place, there's the social, economic aspects of place, the political aspects of place, and so these all fit in and fit together with the ways that people think of their sense of a place. And just this second comment, it's great to hear that this initiative is starting here, because one of the things that, from a governance perspective in natural resource management, is there's an effort to quantify economically the value of ecosystems and ecosystem services. And so you might find that a stream, the trout in the stream are worth X number of dollars because of the tourists who go to visit it or the amenity values that it provides. But the people aren't going because it has an economic value. So it's not the value of the ecosystem that drives it's not the economic value that drives its value. It's the connections that people might have with it that are creating a lot of those.
I don't know whether I bring the mic, but I want to get back to the issue of Californication. If I could. So it was brought up that, not just here, but in our conference last year, that when we talk about a sense of place, there's the sense of place of people that have been in place for quite a while, and the people who come to place as outsiders, as tourists to do the fishing, but also people that come to buy property as a second home, whose attachment to place is, should we say, part-time. And so in urban settings, this gives rise to tensions between long-established communities in urban areas and then the dot-com people that move into those areas. So what is the sort of sense of, that was behind the comment about Californication, because it apparently will happen anyway, what is the sense of place and the tension between people who come in as part-timers or second homeowners or as, people who are using it largely as a recreation space versus the people that are living full-time? What kind of differences in terms of the sense of place do you see?
So there has been some interesting scholarship in the place field on precisely this question, looking at second homeowners. And one of the things that they find is along the lines of what was described earlier in the survey data for the Montana survey, that the second homeowners tend to value the place more for the recreational, naturalistic amenities and values and less for the economic ones, whereas the locals appreciate the value of the resources for maybe the jobs that they would provide. And so you see that kind of what was the rural-urban divide at the Montana scale playing out kind of in the intra-neighborhood scale between residents and visitors.
And in that literature, is the tension primarily or largely a class tension or cultural or some sort of mix?
That's a great question. I have no idea.
Isn't Californication a Red Hot Chili Peppers song?
It is.
Okay, so, well, this is going to be a timeless clash. It's going to go on. It's going to go on and on. I think we have a chapter in here about the conflicts between the Californians who moved into Wyoming, who were very much against, or they were very much in favor of the reintroduction of the wolves into the area to make it more natural or whatever. And the local ranchers are, this is crazy. Don't do that. Those wolves are going to eat our cattle. And we've had a conflict in South Dakota recently over ferrets because some environmentalists are very pro-ferret. And as a result of that, they want prairie dog towns to grow in the West. And the prairie dog towns, because the ferrets eat the prairie dogs, and the ranchers hate the prairie dogs because they dig up their pasture and the cattle step in them and break their legs and they get disease from them and everything. So this has caused a major bit of friction. So how's it going to be resolved? I suppose ultimately by numbers. At some point, the Californians are going to outnumber the local kind of red county rural folks, and that was kind of the point of David's slide the other night, that at some point the balance is going to tip. And when you have 40 million Californians, I think you said, if you have little states like South Dakota with 800,000 and Montana's about that size, it doesn't take much to tip them. So there's going to be a lot of conflict, and the conflict will be on multiple levels. It will be economic in the sense of there are people who have economic industries, whether it's ranching or coal mining or whatever, that they've done for a long time, or copper mining in Butte. And just to be, stereotype grossly, the Californians are probably going to be less interested in coal mining and this sort of thing. So there's going to be tension over that. And then cultural tensions, too. There's going to be a political divide.
So just one quick story on that. Senator Simpson of Wyoming once proposed a bill banning anyone from the East Coast for coming to Wyoming in the summer because they always wanted to preserve it so that no rancher could ever make money.
I want to think about how to put this into a question, but it seems like what you're raising when we talk about sense of place, and in a way, I feel like I've heard a measurement of sense of place. Do Montanans have a stronger sense of place than Texans? And that worries me a little bit because the rub we'll talk about tomorrow with public lands and resources, you have this rub with these shared resources. Do they belong to the people in the nation? And then they're the people who live with them every day and have this strong sense of place. And I wonder, how do you see that playing out? So it's so easy to slip into the importance of place because we live here and this is where we're lucky enough to have those resources. But how do we handle, are those resources, do they belong to the people of the state, to the nation, to indigenous peoples? How does that, is that the rub? How to put that into a question, but it seems like that's part of what we're grappling with. And who owns it?
Waves and coasts and beaches are really interesting in terms of presenting a common pool resource problem. And unlike federal lands, which are owned by the federal government, and state lands, which are owned by the state, the waves and beaches are public trust lands, and so they're actually owned by everyone equally. And there are a lot of interesting sort of social and cultural traditions in surfing culture more widely, but also in specific places about how those resources are fairly apportioned or unfairly, depending on your perspective, between locals and non-locals. It's just a quick anecdote. On the river yesterday, there are waves. This was news to me too. There are waves in rivers that surfers surf, and they have a completely different system for how they go about sharing that resource. So I thought that was news and interesting to me. But to the larger question, that it is a really interesting challenge, and particularly in the light of things that are changing, whether it is the demographics or the environment. Different groups will be affected disproportionately by different changes, and so it's not just managing what's happening now, but it's managing how we're going to deal with these resources in a different future. So.
Yeah, so just thank you once again for this terrific panel, and thanks for this discussion. And is lunch? This is a good time to make a lunch announcement. Is it here? It's in the ballroom. Okay. Okay. Great. Thank you.